So, with Cataclysm's release date hopefully fast approaching us alongside progress of the beta, Cata still remains an expansion of contention for many players. Divided on if it was the worst thing that ever happened to WoW, or if it was actually okay and everyone overreacted a little bit. However, a side to Cataclysm that seems generally agreed upon is that raiding was pretty great. And this is something that I concur, as I had many great memories of raiding tier 11 of Cataclysm and Firelands. And although Dragon's Soul was a tad disappointing, I'd be lying if I said I didn't have fun with it also, even if it did go on for a little while. So raiding in Cata brought us some great challenges, interesting mechanics, and fantastic looking raid gear. So in preparation for Cata's pending release, let's take a look at raiding throughout the expansion, with what's in store to come and some changes to existing systems along the way. But just before we jump in, as always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here, as it helps me out a bunch. So thanks very much indeed. Now, let's get on with it. So to kick off raiding in Cataclysm, we got tier 11, including 3 main raids to take, being Bastion of Twilight, Blackwing Descent, and Throne of the Four Winds. Bastion of Twilight is a 4-boss raid with an optional boss on heroic mode, where leader Cho'Gall has decided to fill himself and his occultists with old god goop, reflecting a place well and truly inhabited with fairly creepy people, being undoubtedly my favourite of the initial 3 raids. Blackwing Descent provided us with a bit of nostalgia from vanilla WoW, serving as a direct continuation of Blackwing Lair, as Nefarian has dived deeper into the mountain after his previous defeat back in vanilla, much like me after going outside and socialising. Blackwing Descent gives us 6 bosses overall, with the final encounter being another face-off against Nefarian, as well as a guest appearance from Onyxia, who can't seem to catch a break from being WoW's loot pinata. Blackwing Descent is a great raid filled with dragons that feel centric and at home for a classic-themed World of Warcraft raid, besides the rage-inducing Omnitron defense system boss at the start, which regularly saw me quit TeamSpeak in the midst of a raid night temper tantrum back in 2010. And finally, the last raid of the main 3 from tier 11 is Throne of the Four Winds, where Alakahir or Alakahar, or well, the giant cloud version of Ragnaros, has returned to his dwelling in the sky. Furious at how much sand there is in Uldum, Throne of the Four Winds to me was the funnest encounter of the initial tier 11 raids, due to the mechanics and flying through the air like you're the Avatar himself. But I also think visually it's a pretty stunning raid, and it's one that's really great fun once you get it down right. So instead of all the main bosses being housed in one raid like Naxxramas at the start of Wrath, we do see a bit of a better split content-wise for the start of Cataclysm, where the majority are split between Blackwing Descent and Bastion of Twilight, to hopefully keep players a bit more engaged who saw this as an issue. Now, alongside the main 3 tier 11 raids, we got Bardinhold as a side raid at the start of Cata also, with Bardinhold essentially being the new Vault of Archivon, where you can claim both PvE and PvP gear throughout Cataclysm's tenure, if victory in Tolbarad is achieved, with Tolbarad being the new Winter Grasp event. And once we get past tier 11, the next big raid for us is Firelands, an iconic raid for World of Warcraft in general, being looked back upon as arguably one of WoW's most favoured raids of all time, which sees us face off with Firelord himself, Ragnaros, but this time on his home turf in the Firelands, in an 8-boss mega raid, as he continues to attempt to burn down the World Tree Nordrassil, as well as destroying your FPS and ping, causing your gaming laptop to overheat and melt. But for those who play retail, basically Ragnaros' plan of destroying Nordrassil is pretty much similar to Phrax's plan to destroy Amirdrassil, which is the new World Tree. Now, the start of Firelands was kind of non-linear, in the fact before you get to Ragnaros' palace, the entire area is essentially free to roam, and also one of the bosses, Shanox, will only appear dependent on your general progress of the raid, but the last 2 bosses prior to Ragnaros really stand as the last line of defense before you go in there and spank him for a second time since Molten Core. And if you decide to pursue Firelands on heroic, you also get a glimpse at Ragnaros' attractive fiery legs. And then to close off the expansion, we get Dragon Soul, the apparent face-off with Deathwing himself, or really, a bunch of bosses before Thrall shoots him out of the sky with a big dinner plate. But Dragon Soul is the final raid for Cataclysm, consisting of 8 bosses that do take you through a variety of zones, such as the Vermis Temple, Deathwing's back, and a trip to where Deathwing also gets his manicures done in the Maelstrom. However, I'll try to keep the spoilers light for anyone who hasn't fully experienced Dragon Soul, and deliver a fairly light-hearted take on it, as lots of players will tell you it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. But being honest, it's actually not that bad of a raid. It's just the final few encounters where we supposedly fight Deathwing are pretty lackluster compared to what the player base was expecting at the time, as we hadn't actually seen that much of Deathwing throughout Cataclysm's story or previous raids, which is a bit weird. And it felt like that we were really building up to this huge face-off that would finally pay off for all the other work, going through and dealing with all the side effects of Deathwing's Cataclysm. But instead we kind of just help out Thrall and the dragon aspects to do all the main work, which came as a disappointment to players and wasn't really a satisfying ending. So keep that in mind as we don't get a proper face-off with Deathwing, or the main big bad of the expansion if you like, unlike how we did with Arthas in Wrath, or like when we fought Illidan and Kil'jaeden in Burning Crusade, which is a running theme of Cata raids, where the storyline can feel a bit disjointed in parts like mentioned. Deathwing doesn't really have much of an impact on the raids himself. He sort of just flies around and gets on with whatever he's getting up to, but the actual raids themselves are great. Now, with reference to changes to raid lockouts, we are likely in store for some interesting changes to how we previously dealt with things in Wrath Classic. If we assume these changes will still be coming to Cataclysm Classic, we will still have the option of 10 or 25 man raids, as well as normal and heroic, but all operating on a flexible raid system, where both 10 and 25 man raiding will drop the same items, just with 25 man dropping more of said items, in an attempt to remove more repeated content that could burn out certain players who had to raid both 10 and 25 each week for specific gear. But with this flexible raid system, it means that raids can only be completed once per week, yet the size of the raid and difficulty can be switched at any point throughout the encounter. For example, you might want to clear the first 2 bosses of Blackwing Descent on normal 10 man, but then switch to 25 man heroic and continue from there, all on the same raid lockout. However, with regards to heroic difficulty, if you switch to heroic mid-instance, you may only continue to progress on heroic in that specific group size. So using the previous example, if you do the first 2 bosses of Blackwing Descent on normal 10 man, switch to heroic 25 man, you can only finish the rest of the raid on heroic 25 man, i.e. you cannot do 10 man heroic or revert back to normal difficulty. So not too flexible in that aspect. But the basic consensus is once a boss has been defeated that week, it remains defeated for the rest of the week on all difficulties. So generally speaking, you can only do each raid 1 time per week, regardless of the raid size or difficulty. And further changes include a change to the raiding currency system, seeing a bit of a reset, as we no longer have the various emblem system that we currently have in Wrath, but instead reset to Justice points and Valor points. Justice points essentially get you the baseline gear to get you into the most recent raid. So for example, at the start of Cata, they'll be equivalent to heroic dungeon level gear, and Valor points reflect the current set of raiding gear, with both being capped at 4,000 points at a time, so it's pretty simple. So for example, at the start of Cata, we will purchase tier 11 gear with Valor points, but when Firelands comes out as tier 12, you will use Valor points to buy tier 12, and tier 11 then becomes purchasable with Justice points. Hopefully it makes the system a bit more explainable or understandable, as in Wrath we have a lot of currencies in the form of emblems, alongside various artifacts from Gamma and Beta dungeons, to then purchase even more gear. And although I love the Wrath emblem system, the Justice points or Valor points system is just easier to keep track of. And of course it wouldn't be a Cata raiding video without mentioning looking for raid, which was originally implemented during the last phase of Cataclysm in Dragon Soul. And currently, to be fair, there are no signs of this being in Cata at launch, nor plans that the devs have mentioned to add it later into Cata either. Yet saying this, the Wrath team did consistently say they wouldn't add Dungeon Finder into the game, but changed their minds and added it the longer Wrath went on, for better or worse. So although it seems to be the stance that Raid Finder will not be in the game, I suppose it's something we will simply have to live in fear of until the point it does. And a slightly goofy light-hearted note to these Cata raids was that they were mostly only accessible by flying mounts, unless you got summoned to the entrance of the raid or inside by a warlock, which really did separate the men from the boys, in terms of who had made the clever decision to save their money to pay for the new world flying skill. And if you could have guessed it, I was always asking for a summon. Now, a last decent point of change, as I'm sure you'll have been repeatedly told by now, is that there'll be a huge difficulty ramp up for raiding in Cataclysm, and I think it'll be interesting to see how this turns out, as it was certainly true back in the day. However, generally speaking, as players we seem to be a bit more skilled now, likely as a result of experience and add-ons. And there's about a decade's worth of available guides for Cata. I'd probably argue that we'll see a similar approach to Ulduar, in that yeah, it's slightly harder than previous content, but realistically the difficulty jump won't be as harsh this time around. But don't get me wrong, still expect to have to use a little more brain power for the raids than usual, which isn't always a bad thing. I found the tactics to be pretty fun, especially in raids like Throne of the Four Winds or Blackwing Descent, except for Omnitron Defense System. That boss still has me scarred to this day. So there's a quick glance at what's to come for us throughout Cataclysm's raiding tenure, as well as some technical details of the way in which lockouts change, groups and currencies differ, and how difficulty will feel. Overall, I'm excited to jump back into Cataclysm the longer we build up to it, and hopefully we'll see it sooner rather than later. But till then, I'll be reading guides on Omnitron defense system, just to be sure that it doesn't make me cry so much this time around. But all in all, do let me know what you're looking forward to most about Cataclysm Classic, and just how you'll be taking on the expansion this time around in the comments. As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.